The Australian Financial Review.
Those who migrate from liberal democracies have a greater likelihood of subscribing to Australian values compared to those coming from other places ruled by fundamentalists, extremists and dictators.
On Tuesday, Liberal Party leader Angus Taylor announced a new hardline immigration policy, one that will discriminate based on values.
Critics say it's nothing more than a dog whistle to One Nation's supporters.
It's a policy aimed squarely at winning back Conservative voters the party has lost to One Nation.
I'm worried about some people coming here who don't share our values and lifestyle, who don't want to integrate into our society. And I think Pauline Hanson is not afraid to say what the other parties won't.
These voters are worried about immigration, cost of living and housing affordability.
You know, and if we extrapolate that result from South Australia, where they won 4 state seats, it's not improbable that One Nation could be in double figures in terms of federal seats after the next federal election.
Welcome to The Fin. I'm Fiona Buffini, in this week for Lisa Murray. Today, political editor Phil Coorey and Redbridge pollster Kos Samaras on the sudden rise of One Nation, what's driving it, how far it could go, and what it says about how Australia is changing. It's Thursday, April 16. Hi, Phil.
Hi, Fiona.
Hi, Kos.
Hi, Fiona.
Phil, let's start with you. It seems nearly every week there's another poll showing the rise in popularity of One Nation. What is going on with the One Nation vote?
Well, it's very high. It's the highest it's ever been. It's also more than a threat. We've seen it rise in 2 tiers, Fiona. So after the election, One Nation only got about 6 or so % at the last federal election nationwide. But then something happened after that and they rose steadily, essentially based on grievance. And at the centre of that grievance was immigration.
Yep.
You know, the high immigration levels, and then people attributing a lot of their problems to that, whether warranted or not. We got to about December last year and all the published polls, including our Redbridge poll, the AFR and News poll and the Australian, had them at around sort of 16, 17, 18%. And it looked like they had plateaued at that level, which was still very high on a primary vote.
Yep.
And then when the Bondi massacre happened in the middle of December last year, support for One Nation again rose markedly.
One Nation continues to surge ahead in the polls.
One Nation surging up to 26%.
Primary votes of 20 to 30% across the country.
Pauline Hanson is now the country's most favoured leader, according to new polling out today.
And the view internally was that that massacre in Bondi had lit a fuse, again under this anti-immigration sentiment that Pauline Hanson had been fostering. As we said, their support was around 18%, and now it's in the sort of mid to high 20s. In our most recent poll, 29%. We often see this in polls. People register a protest or unhappiness with the major parties. But then we came to the South Australian state election.
This election, the undercard is getting as much attention as the main event.
Just under a month ago in South Australia, and we saw for the first time in a long time that translated into actual people voting that way.
With One Nation scoring 22% of the primary vote, well ahead of the Liberal Party.
Where One Nation picked up, I think, 4 seats in the lower house and 3 in the upper house.
The election outcome sending tremors through federal politics. The swing towards One Nation unprecedented.
So it was a sign that people aren't just telling pollsters one thing to send a message to the major parties, are also now prepared to do it at the ballot box.
Where are they taking votes from, Phil?
Oh, look, mostly the Liberal Party and the Nationals. Labor, to a large extent, has firewalled itself from that One Nation vote, but it's starting to nibble at Labor's sides. Their primary votes, sort of depending on what poll you look at, is a couple of % lower than it was at the election. It represents just a real fragmentation of the right of centre vote now in Australia.
How would you describe it for the Liberals?
It's not just that they're in a really dire position. It seems that whatever they're trying isn't working. They changed leaders from Susan Lee to Angus Taylor and didn't get any lift in the polls whatsoever. And that's the first time I can remember, a leadership change, either an opposition leadership change or a Prime Minister, where there was no boost in the polls.
And Kos, the number of people voting for minor parties has been rising for over 20 years now. We've seen voters move to the Greens and more recently the Teals. But who is switching to One Nation now? Break it down for us.
As Phil touched on, it's largely Australians who have a history of voting for the Liberal Party and to a lesser extent the National Party. it definitely does have a very strong economic bent to it all. The biggest, most common trait for someone who has moved over to One Nation in the last 6 months is that they've got a TAFE or trade qualification. They live in the outer suburbs of our large cities or in the regions. They are most likely in their late 40s, definitely in their 50s, and to a lesser extent in their 60s. And they're feeling financial stress. So of all Australians that we survey who are either Gen X or baby boomers, and those individuals who report to us that they are experiencing extreme financial stress, One Nation's primary vote is at 42%. And it's not just Gen X or baby boomers. There are younger Australians that are moving across to One Nation. The numbers are smaller, but also the story is very similar, and that is these younger Australians have a history of voting for the Liberal Party, or the National Party, or the LNP in Queensland.
And an almost parallel things happening on the other side of politics, right?
What we're seeing across, I would say, most Western democracies is a polarisation of grievance politics. Younger Australians, for example, are more likely now to choose the Greens as a vehicle for their frustration towards, I would say, the two major parties. Again, 42% of Generation Z, that is Australians between the ages of 18 and 28 years of age, who are experiencing financial stress, report to us that they plan to vote for the Greens. That number shoots up to close to 50% when we're just talking to women in that age group who are feeling the economic pain out there. And that's a very similar trend that we're seeing across the world. So in the UK, very similar patterns.
The Green Party has hailed its by-election victory in Gorton and Denton in Manchester as seismic.
The Gorton-Denton by-election in the heart of Manchester.
This Manchester constituency has had a Labour MP.
The Greens won that seat.
For almost 100 years, until now.
And again, fueling that move was the younger Brits. The flip side is that in the UK, just like here, older people are going to reform.
Nigel Farage says Reform UK is now the main opposition party.
The Nigel Farage Populist Party.
After winning a by-election, one mayoralty and dozens of council seats in local elections.
And we're seeing the same trend here, and that is that older Australians are more likely to move to One Nation than to the Greens if they are feeling the financial pinch, and more importantly, if they think the two-party system has failed them.
Yeah, we're often told that populist parties like One Nation are exploiting voter grievances, and it does feel like people are grieving an Australia that they feel no longer exists or has sort of passed them by. What are their biggest concerns, Phil?
Look, I think this is this sense of unfairness in society which Kos walked us through, but the basic rights of passage for young people that we knew sort of no longer exist. If you're 18 years old, and you're doing something as basic as an arts degree, you're staring at a $50,000 debt just for that. Then there's the sense you're never going to own a house. And that all feeds into this sense of hopelessness and anger that's taken hold amongst younger people and is also causing concern and grief amongst their parents. It's just this sense that the whole system has failed. I always believe if you fix the housing affordability problem in this country, you would right the ship.
Right.
Housing seems to be at the core of this whole sense of intergenerational unfairness. And for the people who go to One Nation, the main reason they cite is immigration. If you go back to the early Redbridge Australian Financial Review polls, Fiona, back in about July last year when they first started escalating in popularity.
The hardline anti-immigration party rising up.
The first thing we noticed was that One Nation became the party most preferred out of all the political parties to deal with immigration.
People are warming to our policies.
That really leapt out of one of the polls.
They want to vote for One Nation now because they don't trust the two major political parties.
Today, they're like at 40% and almost double what Labor and Liberals are. So that was the first sign that the high levels of migration into the country, then being blamed for the squeeze on housing and everything else, was really at the core of this. And again, after Bondi, one Nation person said to me they got 18,000 new members in the fortnight after Bondi. So it sort of starts in immigration, but then it spreads into, people believing that's the source of so many problems. Hanson just sort of says it, right? Pauline Hanson just says it.
And it is about Islam.
It's too hard for the major parties to have a pop because they are so dependent on the immigrant vote too. And if you get into that space, it can be really dangerous.
They're not people compatible and suitable for this country.
But Hanson just says it, and people feel they can't speak their mind anymore, but Hanson doesn't, and so she articulates what they're feeling. They're not even looking to for solutions, just airs their grievance.
Yeah.
Yeah, we are now in a new political paradigm which demands authenticity from political leaders. Politicians who speak their mind and don't sound like they're reading off a media release and are authentic and stick to their guns on policy, even if it's unpopular within certain quarters, are attractive to a growing number of voters in this country. I think on the left side of politics, that's missing at the moment. But we could see sort of the left-wing alternative to that in the UK and other countries, where Mandami in New York, for example, was another good example, of what happens when someone presents themselves as an authentic alternative to the managerial class that has dominated our political landscape since the Second World War. We've seen a gradual decline of particular traditional industries, especially in regional Australia, so timber, abattoirs, a lot of industry being shipped overseas, a lot of that capacity being shipped to China, for example. And when we're talking about a lot of these Australians who are abandoning the two-party system, they are, by and large, not consuming information or media like, I would say, baby boomers used to consume it 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Now, you can go and harvest whatever opinion and news you want right across the world. People will now seek out news that aligns with their values and their opinions and belief systems. News is no longer a platform that impacts political thought within the broader Australian public, but rather adds to that, I would say, siphoning of opinions into particular ecosystems.
So let's dig a little deeper and talk about my home state, Queensland. Because from what you're seeing in the numbers, that's the state where One Nation could do really well in the next federal election. Why is Queensland the state to watch, Kos?
Yeah, so what we're seeing in Queensland is, yes, this is where One Nation is doing the best. Its polling is extraordinary. Based on our numbers alone, One Nation is the biggest political party when it comes to polling right now. It is where I would expect One Nation to win a significant number of federal seats. Why is that? Now, on top of everything we've talked about the economic abandonment and people abandoning the two-party system, there's also some demographics that are driving this. And to give you the contrast, so for Victoria and New South Wales, for example, Australians who were born in England have always historically been across this country the number one non-Australian born constituency. And that applies to Victoria and New South Wales, but that has changed. So in Victoria now, the largest non-Australian born constituency is from the Indian diaspora. And to give you an illustration of how significant that change has been, at the turn of this century, there were over 200,000 Victorians who were born in England, and only 80,000 from the Indian diaspora. That has now completely switched, and we now have over 100,000 more Indian Australians in Victoria than those who were born in England. And laying into that, Chinese Australians are now just as numerous in states of New South Wales and Victoria as those that were born in England as well. Queensland, on the other hand, doesn't have any of these traits. So Queensland is still very much dominated by either Australian-born or those who were born in England. It's about a sense that a particular political party doesn't want me here because of who I am, where I've come from. And this is the mindset that is extremely prevalent within the Chinese and Indian Australian communities in this country right now. So the Liberal Party is caught in a bit of a vice. The more they talk about immigration and they feel like they have to do that to chase the One Nation vote, the more they endanger their position in diverse Melbourne and Sydney, particularly within these communities that we've been talking about. That's important because what we also know is that if you were born in England and you live in this country, the median age of that particular constituency is 52 years of age. A lot more conservative, more likely to harbour anti-immigration views, and of course more likely to find One Nation a lot more appealing.
But it is naturally a conservative state. Matt Canavan is sort of a good bellwether for the way the north and west of Queensland thinks. And if you go back again to the second half of last year, where he started pushing very hard internally for the coalition to dump net zero, amongst other things, they opposed a gun buyback after Bondi, stuff like that. I mean, he's always been naturally conservative, but everything he's saying now is not just because he thinks that, it's because it's the One Nation threat. You go to his speech at the Press Club last week, for example.
I am proposing a revolution. Some of it will need the slaying of long overdue sacred cows.
Where he talked about, bringing back protectionism and decrying neoliberal policy making, on economics.
Our naive belief that open trade and open borders and open flows of people are always and everywhere going to be the best thing for our country. But they're clearly not the right approach now.
He's been arguing internally, we've got to get serious, otherwise the National Party could disappear, and Queensland is the heart of the National Party. Queensland will be one to watch, but I'm sure Kos will agree. One Nation's polling well everywhere, including even in Victoria, where we're going to get the next test later this year with the state election there. And if we extrapolate that result from South Australia, where they won 4 state seats, it's not improbable that One Nation could be in double figures in terms of federal seats after the next federal election.
We're talking about the sudden surge in the One Nation vote, where more than 1 in 4 Australians now say they would vote for what was really a fringe party just one election ago. Kos, you're tracking voter movements and sentiment all the time. Where do you reckon this could end up?
That's still a bit of an open question to be answered. We're going to have to see what happens in Victoria later this year at their state election. And the reason we need to wait for those sort of, I would say, live ballot examples is because in South Australia, we learned a couple of things. This is the South Australian state election that recently won by the Labor camp. So One Nation secured a very significant primary vote in South Australia, but picked up only a handful of seats because, yes, South Australia is geographically limiting for them, but they have to secure a very high primary vote versus the Liberal Party or the Coalition to win, because Labor preferences will favour the Coalition before One Nation. So they have to secure a primary in the high 30s and 40s. That dynamic definitely still applies at a federal level. For them to win seats, they need to outpoll the Coalition by a significant number, and that's the only way they can. So my prediction right now, as it currently stands, is that they'll probably win up to about a dozen seats federally. Yes, Labor can be put under pressure by One Nation at a federal level in places like the Hunter, central New South Wales coastal electorates, for example, and probably out of suburban Melbourne. But again, it's very difficult to see One Nation pick up too many seats in outer urban Melbourne and Sydney because of that diversity factor that we've been talking about. So in electorates that have got very large number of first-generation migrants are kryptonite to One Nation.
And Phil, how do you think the major parties are responding?
Well, Labor is continuing to do what it's been doing since it's been in government, and that's spending money and giving people stuff, because Albanese has long been aware of this sense of grievance. And he's always had that motto, if people feel the economy's working against them rather than for them, that's where you end up with your Donald Trumps and your Nigel Farages. And he's been saying that since he became Prime Minister, even as opposition leader, and even when they introduced those industrial relations changes. And Albanese justifies those IR changes by making that same point about giving people a proper wage and trying to limit the sort of the wealth gap in society that's led to this splintering overseas. And we're seeing it again now in their response to the fuel crisis, and we'll probably see more in the May budget. One Nation does oppose all those IR reforms, especially penalty rates and the big pay rises and stuff like that. They tend to fall on the side of business for things like that. So Labor will use that again to portray One Nation as anti-worker. And I think that's what's keeping Labor largely, not completely insulated from that sort of One Nation backlash at the moment. As for the Coalition, well, Andrew Hastie is proving to be a better foil for One Nation than, say, Angus Taylor. After the South Australian election, for example, Angus Taylor didn't do any media until the following Thursday, and then he only spoke again about petrol, whereas both Canavan and Hastie had been out with lines on One Nation, prepared to take it up to them. One of the reasons people in the Liberal Party were backing Hastie against Taylor when they did the leadership was he was viewed as a better foil against Hanson. And I think that's starting to sort of show.
A lot of people who've parked their vote with One Nation now have very legitimate concerns around energy, around immigration, around housing.
Yeah, Andrew Hastie has correctly worked out, in my opinion as a researcher, how to tackle One Nation from a conservative angle.
A lot of Australians feel like the system is rigged against them.
He is using patriotism as the tool. He's basically calling out Hanson as being un-Australian for aligning herself up with Trump, who most Australians do not like, significant numbers of conservative Australians do not like, and more importantly, at least 40% of One Nations do not like. He's been on the record criticising the current conflict in Iran. That's clearly having an economic impact on many Australians, many of the Australians that we've been talking about that are feeling the pinch.
So we either fix the system or it's torn down by people like Pauline Hanson.
He's framed her really well, and I think if that's the narrative that the coalition side of politics utilises, being delivered by someone like him, because how he delivers it comes across as authentic, doesn't sound like it's scripted or comes off a media release. And it's in contrast to Angus Taylor's comment when he was asked about, do you think Trump's comment around ending civilization in Iran was appropriate? Angus's reply to it was, well, it's not the words I would have chosen. That just drives Australians mad because they know that's not the answer.
Yeah.
The answer is a bit more forthright, which did come from Hastie.
We haven't seen a lot of One Nation policies, but that doesn't seem to matter to voters. And they've got a history of selecting candidates with colourful or criminal pasts. But Phil, are they different now?
Look, One Nation is a much different party now than it was, say, 30 years ago, Fiona. When they won those 11 seats in the Queensland Parliament back in 1998, not one of them made it to the next election. Yeah, they had sort of kooks and cranks and all sorts. And we've had candidates with checkered histories. Now, since this fellow James Ashby sort of took over at One Nation in terms of running the party, he's essentially Pauline Svengali. Ashby comes from the Liberal Party. He's quite a ruthless and effective political operative. And some years ago, he started professionalising One Nation as an outfit.
Yep.
You know, it's even simple things like they're operating out of an old shop front in Queensland. They now lease a proper office building. You know, so if you're going to be a political party, you've got to look like one. You know, they have a lounge room for volunteers and free Coke machines and things like that, and a proper sort of secretariat. They're using the same databases that the major parties use here for candidate screening, so you can pick up people with criminal records. Also, too, if you want to join the party, they just don't take anyone or any ratbag or malcontent. You actually got to bring some sort of ability now to One Nation.
Right.
The big move, of course, was late last year when Barnaby Joyce defected from the National Party to One Nation. That's all about succession. One Nation is actually known as Pauline Hanson's One Nation. It's still registered as that, but they're in the process of taking the Pauline Hanson out of it. Pauline is going to be 74 at the next election. She will win her seat in Queensland, but the plan is that she'll probably retire and hand that Senate spot to someone else, and Joyce will become the leader. And they needed someone of Joyce's calibre if the party's going to survive, because we see these parties all the time, you know, the Jackie Lambie Network and the Bobcat or whatever they are and so forth. They often don't survive very long, and especially once the person they're named after disappears, so does the party. So there's a seriousness about One Nation to transition beyond Pauline. She'll still be like a spiritual leader like Yoda. She won't be going anywhere, but no one expects her to sort of serve the full term if she wins the next election, and that's why Barnaby is of a sufficient profile and cachet, if you like, to continue the show.
Okay, a final question to both of you. It feels like the rise of One Nation could change politics forever, but do you think it will be an enduring political force in this country?
We can already see it writ large in Andrew Hastie's interview on Insiders a couple of weeks ago, where he made it very clear that as far as he's concerned, the Liberal Party should not be the last line of defence for neoliberalism and for multinationals. I think he's joining a growing chorus of politicians, not just in this country. We have seen what's happening in Hungary, for example, where a centre-right party has dislodged the right-wing populist government, and they've dislodged them by basically promising to tax corporates a lot more and taxing the rich a lot more. So corporate Australia needs to develop its own relationship with the Australian public and build a social licence that is enduring and not rely on the political class to deliver any outcomes for them, because what we're going to see is a race to the bottom as to who can beat up corporates the fastest. Australians are starving for genuine reform that fixes wicked problems they know require complex solutions, and they really hate band-aid politics.
Look, it's endured for 30 years. There's no reason to suggest One Nation will go away anytime soon. I think ultimately what will decide their fate is if the economy improves, we get inflation back under control, oil prices go down, and they can do something about housing, then you lessen the grievance and you lessen the reason to, as Kos famously says, burn the house down, which is the sort of mood people are in at the moment. And so we'll see in this budget, you'll see some very concrete, fairly deliberate steps by Albanese in the May 12 budget to really address these problems. And this goes to what we were saying earlier about Labor trying to stay ahead of this grievance curve. I think you can take it to the bank. They're going to pare back the capital gains tax exemption for housing. It won't raise much money, but it's the message they want to send to the disenchanted. They may do something on negative gearing. They may do something on trusts. I wouldn't call it the anti-boomer budget, but it's designed to try and send a message to sort of the millennials and even the Gen Xers struggling with all this stuff, that they hear the message. So if governments can deliver and they can make things better, they can sort of give people reasons not to vote for One Nation.
Thanks, Phil.
Pleasure, Fiona.
Thanks, Kos.
See yous. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to The Fin. To read more stories about the rise of One Nation, see the links in the show notes. The Fin is produced by Mandy Coulin. The head of audio is Alex Gow, who also composed our theme. If you enjoyed this episode, send it to a friend as it helps others find us, and follow us wherever you listen. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to The Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. I'm Fiona Buffini. Lisa will be back next week.
The Australian Financial Review.